It's about a couple that decides to adopt kids through the foster care system, and it is inspired by my life and my wife and I coming to a very similar decision to adopt kids from the foster care system. Our journey started the exact same way that the characters in the movie do. My wife and I were talking about whether or not we wanted to have kids, and we had been kind of having this conversation off and on for years. And then I said at one point, I just feel like I'm getting a little old to have kids. Like I don't want to be that old dad that can't throw the ball. And I said, as a joke, I said to my wife, well, why don't we just adopt a 5-year-old and then it'll be like I got started 5 years ago. And my wife said, I would really consider that. And I said, yeah, I was really just kidding. And it just somehow a conversation sprung up out of that. And we also did, I'm not proud of it, but we did have a conversation about how we adopted our dog and how that worked out well. And we ended up, visiting some websites like the characters do in the movie and getting a little bit hooked in there and just seeing the need and seeing the kids' faces and seeing what was kind of going on out there a little bit. And that led us to an orientation, just like in the movie. And the orientation led us into the classes and eventually into meeting our kids. My wife and I we went to a real adoption fair. And the kids that we met at the adoption fair, it was 3 kids, and they were all teenagers. Well, they were 11, 13, and 16. And there was a 16-year-old girl and 11-year-old girl, a 16-year-old girl, and a 13-year-old boy who we met at the adoption fair. We did not go there wanting teenagers. Just like in the movie, we saw them all off to the side by themselves, and it was really heartbreaking. And we wound up meeting these 3 siblings, and we knew nobody else was probably going to step up for these kids. And we wound up, it was very terrifying, but we wound up, kind of putting those kids on our sheet. And then they matched us with these 3 kids. And that was even more terrifying because we were going to have teenagers moving into our home. And it ended up not happening because, similar to the Lizzie character in the story, the 16-year-old girl was very attached to her birth mother, but her birth mother wasn't stepping up for them at all. They had been in foster care for 4 years, and it just didn't look like anything was going to change, but she was holding on pretty tight, so she didn't want to have a new placement, as it turned out. So when that ended up falling apart, it was this very arbitrary phone call where the social workers called us and said, well, we've spoken to her a number of times. She doesn't want to do it. But there's these other 3 kids. And then those other 3 kids are now my children. So even though it was a strange road to get to them, I'm glad that I got to them because, I love them more than anything now. So a lot of the things that happened were funny. They just were. A lot of it was frustrating and sad and terrifying, but a lot of it was funny too. And I also just had the thought that when I got into this and I learned about the classes and the social workers and the foster care system and the kids and all this stuff, I didn't know anything about any of it. It isn't anything that, if it's touched on in movies, I feel like it's touched on in a more distant way. So I thought, this would be great if John and I could make a comedy about this, so it doesn't have to be this gut-wrenching drama that people are afraid to go see, that we could do something. Because my real experience was funny, and it was warm, and it was heartbreaking, and it was warm, and it was funny. So I thought, we could make a movie that really captures all of that, and I think it would be a movie that people would want to go see, and then, obviously my hope is that the result of it is that more people are educated about how this stuff works. And more than anything, that maybe more people, when they're starting a family or when they're thinking about adding to their family, that they'll consider these kids, there's so many of them out there, and that possibly this little comedy could help to directly lead to kids finding families and homes. I think we're handling the sensitive subjects just by being honest about them, and which can be difficult, to be honest about this stuff because some of this stuff is harsh, some of it's ugly, some of it's sad, but it's all there. It's all in the. I did some preliminary research unintentionally by going through the whole. Foster classes and all of that myself with my wife, and we met people, we met kids, we met other families. We went to Care Group, which is that support group that's depicted in the movie, and we heard from those families. And so, at the time that I was doing all that, I didn't realize that I wasn't doing it obviously for research of a script. But then years later, when John and I decided to write this story, then I went back and started talking to my old social worker again, and met with more families and more kids, and we just wanted to be as honest as we could about these situations that people find themselves in. And then as far as the comedy goes, I mean, like I said, there were a lot of funny things that either happened to me or stories that I heard from other people, situations that you get into, because the whole thing is just awkward. I mean, to go into a situation where you bring people into your home that all of a sudden become your children and you don't even know them yet and they don't even know you is just like a comedy of manners right out of the gate. At first, I think the first couple drafts I was picturing my family, but then as we started to incorporate more stories from other people, stories from the social workers, as we started to make it more of an amalgamation of different, of different people's experiences, then the characters just became more of characters that were, more inspired by my family, but not really my family anymore. One of the first things we did when we decided to write the script is I called my old social worker who is now retired, and she put me in touch with somebody from the organization that she worked for, a woman named Allison, who's since become a consultant on our movie. And she hooked John and I up with two really wonderful evenings where the first night we sat with a bunch of parents who had adopted kids and particularly teenage girls. And then the next night we sat with those girls, some of whom were still teenagers, some of whom were older. And that night we had already had a rough draft, and we knew who we wanted Lizzie roughly to be. And when we met all these girls, Mairead really stood out because she reminded us in some ways of Lizzie. She was really smart. She was articulate. She was very together, and very honest with the way that she would tell her story. And so Mairead inspired a lot of things. First of all, we gave her our draft, and she gave us a bunch of great notes on the draft, and helped us to kind of dial it in and make it a little bit more honest, and in some cases brutally honest. And Mairead also provided some of the story that the young woman tells at the adoption orientation. Some of that is directly lifted from Mairead's real life. So she was a huge help, and throughout the whole process, we were calling her. And I was, sending her drafts and bouncing things off of her and just trying to get her take on things. And then when the movie finally got greenlit and we were going to get it made, I called her. It was actually one of the most fun phone calls I had, to be able to call Mairead and tell her that I wanted her to come to Atlanta and be a part of all this. She was pretty excited. One of the things that I found really surprising, and Russ has this line in the script where he goes, "Wow, they just look like normal kids," and it seems like a nearly offensive thing to say, but it's a feeling that you have when you first sort of lay eyes on groups of foster, kids who are, in the foster care system, and you see just that, oh, wow, oh yeah, they're just kids. They're just like a bunch of kids. So I wanted everybody to be able to see these kids. Now, because, when they're in the foster system, there's obviously a lot of rules about using, putting them in a movie, using their images and stuff like that. So what we did is we went out and we got adoptive families who had adopted kids. So these kids were already legally adopted, but it was great to have so many of them together in the park and to let people have that experience that I had of like, oh, look at all these kids. They just look like normal kids. And there was even the question would come up, well, which ones are, because we also had just, we didn't have enough. So we had background extras that weren't, from foster care. And, nobody could tell the difference. And that's sort of the point, you know? Well, I always had Mark in mind because, he's playing me. And no, that's not true. No, I had Mark in mind because we had just done the two Daddy's Home movies with him. And I thought to see a guy like Mark who plays these like really stoic kind of badass action heroes and that kind of thing, to see him, and also a guy he's not at all afraid to have that gear and be a little, you know, I don't know, just he's not one of those actors that just wants to look cool all the time. He'll kind of go to all kinds of different places. So I thought watching Mark become unhinged by the kids, watching him become emotional over the kids, watching him become overwhelmed with emotion in the end of the movie, I knew it would mean more, coming out of that face. So I was always excited about that idea. I honestly wasn't sure if he would do it though, and because we hadn't talked about it or anything. And then when I finally kind of got the nerve to bring it up to him, and he just jumped on it, I couldn't have been more excited. And then once you have Mark Wahlberg interested in your movie, this thing that became, that started as, okay, we've got a rough draft of a script and we've got, and all of a sudden Mark was involved. Then it became, oh, wow, this is happening. We got to figure out who our Ellie is, And Ellie was a bit of a tough decision as well, because the character was always written to be really fiery and really somebody who gets worked up like she does on Thanksgiving, and somebody who is very passionate and excited. And Rose she's like Mark in that way, where Rose it's a pretty rare thing that Mark does, where he can do these action movies and he can do suspense movies and he can do comedies and he can do drama. And, there aren't a lot of people out there that do that on either side. So, we talked about Rose, that Rose was one of the few people that really does comedy well and really does drama well. And, she was insidious, it's like she does it all, So when that idea came up and then when she was interested, it all just kind of fell into place. Mark and Rose just turned out to be so great together, and they have a great chemistry together. And then just the way that the cast fell into place, and more than any movie I've done, it really felt that way, that just one by one, everybody just kind of dropped in, where, Karen and Sharon, we knew they were going to be so important to the story. I never thought that I would be able to reel in Octavia Spencer. And then when Octavia wanted to do it, that was such a huge get for us, because we wanted her so bad, but we thought, sure, we wouldn't have a chance. And then it became this thing of, who do we pair with Octavia? Who would be the great yin to her yang, And we talked about a whole bunch of ideas. And then when Notaro came up, that idea, and again, it felt like it was such a good idea that it just felt like, she's probably going to be on tour, she's going to be busy, and then it turned out she wanted to do it, and it just felt like piece by piece. And then people that, I'm not going to lie, I wasn't familiar with Eliza Schlesinger before she came in to read for us for October, and then I found out after that she's this huge stand-up with all these Netflix specials, and we didn't cast her for that reason. We didn't cast her because, weren't thinking, she's a big stand-up and she'll put eyes on the movie. She just came in and was funny as shit in the audition, and then we cast her, and then found out, bonus, she's got a following. I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm drawn to happy endings. I'm drawn to, put me in front of Field of Dreams and I'm gonna be a mess. Like, I'm just that guy, I'm not gonna lie. But I felt like this subject matter, to do a movie that has a really warm heart and has, and has a way to take people into some darker places, but to ultimately make people feel good, is honest, and it's not bullshit in this movie, because all of the parents that I've met, without exception, and I've met people who have gone through journeys way harder than mine and way harder than these characters' journeys. And the one thing that they all have in common is that every one of them say they wouldn't have it any other way, that it brought something, a massively important part to their life. So all of the stories, even the very worst ones, they all have happy endings. because you always have these families that are glad they did what they did. So that was a reason why I just thought, well, this is definitely a movie that can be a comedy and can be warm-hearted. Sheila, our casting director, said, well, Isabela just did Transformers like a couple years ago with Mark, kind of even a similar thing where she played kind of this orphaned kid. And I said, well, that's not going to work. We can't do that, you know? Well, I know, but, you know, she's going to Skype in and we're just going to do a quick audition. And, you know, we said we would, and Mark said that we should look at her. And all right. And I just kind of thought, well, this is a waste of time because that's just weird. She just did a movie with him and what. So she runs through a couple of the scenes. And by the time she's done, we're all completely in tears. And we're like, okay, that'll work. And she got the part right away. We went from any actor that can take you from thinking this is a non-starter to thinking there's no other way to do this. She just killed it. So that was exciting, and she's been killing it all the way through the movie. Juliana, who plays Lita, came in, and we had looked at a bunch of little kids, and it's really tough. She's 6. You know, to get a 6-year-old to do what you need him to do in a movie is difficult. So what you're looking for more than anything is you're just looking for kids that have a personality and who can listen and who can kind of pay attention, and you know that you can kind of work with them, because sometimes you put a 6-year-old in a room and they're just, you know, bouncing off the walls. So Juliana came in, and we could tell that she was pretty new to it, but she could listen, and she had some experience. She was adorable, and she really had a personality, and that was the main thing, that she just had such a huge personality on her. And then Gustavo, we had a different idea of who Juan was. Juan was going to be more keyed up, and he was going to be more like 8 or 9 years old. And Gustavo came in, and Gustavo was 12 years old, and he was so low key. And he was so sweet. There was just this kindness in his eyes. And he actually reminded me of my son Johnny a little bit. He just had this just sweetness that just poured out of him. And so we read him, and we thought, well, he's not quite what we were looking for. But then we just kind of couldn't stop thinking about him. And we thought, well, why couldn't Juan be a little bit older, and that there was something that I liked even better about him being a little bit older and yet the sweetest, you know, the one who is like the most vulnerable, you know, in the bunch. And then we wound up kind of retooling some of the scenes to fit him. And so glad that we met him, because he brought a lot to that character that we didn't have on the page and that we added later after meeting him. All I can really do is tell him about my experience with it. And I do this often, and people ask me often, and I just tell them about the great experience that I had with it, and that it wasn't easy, that there were, you know, the conversation that Pete and Ellie have in the movie where they're like, I hate them so much. That was me and my wife having that conversation. We just so badly wanted to get these kids out of our house. It was a nightmare for a little while. But when it changed, and when we all kind of figured it out and we settled in, it was the greatest part of my life, you know? So I guess, you know, it's something that I think a lot of people they don't consider, they don't think of it. There's a stigma where I think people feel like, you know, all these things are touched on in the movie, as far as people feeling like, oh, these are the children of criminals, or, you know, psychos, or whatever the hell people think this is, when really they're just kids. And also that people tend to have this notion that, well, if we make our own kid, then that kid's going to be perfect, but we're sort of rolling the dice with these other kids. And it's like, dude, you're rolling the dice no matter what you do. My wife and I, when we were having the conversations early on, we hit on this thought, which was the fact that we're even willing to consider this. We almost have to do it, because most people aren't willing to even consider it. So I feel like if you're one of those people that would even consider it, not that you have to do it, but you at least have an obligation to investigate it further, because if you're willing to consider it, then you're one of those people that can do this, and I think would get a lot out of it. I'm just hoping that it'll make people think about these kids that are out there, and like I said, when they're people who are starting families or adding to their families, that they'll just consider it, that they'll just look into it, that they'll just have a 5-minute conversation about it. And if at the end of the day that they go, no, we want to have our own kids, or we want to, do something else, great. But I think if more people would just have a 5-minute conversation about this, then more kids would wind up having families and homes.